This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode, where my guest is Tom Hirons, a poet whose work resonates deeply with the primal and ungovernable forces of nature, the human condition, and the intersections where they meet. His writing, including the much-lauded poem Sometimes a Wild God, stirs something ancient within, reminding readers of the chaos and beauty that lie at the heart of existence. In this conversation, we delve into the inspirations and philosophies behind his work, exploring the wild, untamed forces that shape his poetry and his perspective on creativity.
Well, I'm 51 now, and I live in South Devon, but I grew up in East Anglia, kind of in the middle of nowhere, on the Suffolk-Norfolk border. And yeah, without giving you my whole life history, I moved when I was 17, went up to Scotland for 20 years. So I was there till I was like 37. Then I moved down to Wales. I was there for a little bit. I'd never been to Devon, really. I'd been through it on the way to Cornwall, as you do going on holiday. And then when I was living in Wales, I fell in love with the woman who became the mother of my children, Rima Staines, amazing artist, and came to Dartmoor. And I had no idea that anything like this existed in the south of England. Obviously, been up in Scotland, there's a whole load of fairly wild places, but having something down in this neck of the woods, and it's got a strong and alive spirit to it. So now I live on the edge of Dartmoor, and it seems to just about keep me sane, because otherwise living in the south of England would just be a bit crazy.
And is it fair to describe you as a poet?
It is fair at this stage, I think, to describe me as a poet. I can't remember when I started introducing myself as a poet. I think when I started making money from selling poetry books. But I can still remember that the first time, must be, over 10 years now. Obviously, I've been writing for a lot longer than that, but it was about 10 years ago. I think I introduced myself to someone as a poet for the first time when they asked, what do you do for a living? And I said, I'm a poet. And they actually laughed in my face. And I could totally understand why, because it's such a ridiculous proposition to actually make a living from poetry. But also it's one of those slightly ridiculous professions. It's like saying you're a clown for a living or something like that. It's a bit weird, which is interesting to me. We have these certain things where we have a lot of ideas about what they're supposed to be like. And certainly the image of a poet is a complex one in this country. I love asking people when they think of a poet, what does a poet look like? When you think of a poet, what does a poet look like to you?
Well, immediately I have to say floppy hair, don't I think?
Floppy hair, for sure.
Yeah.
Are they healthy or are they unwell?
I think they're probably a little bit tortured, so they might not be in the best of health, that, they may have to kind of go through certain rites of passage involving substances. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I'm just spouting all the stereotypical stuff about tortured poets. So.
But that's what we have. That's mostly the image. It's a bit more nuanced when you ask people from other countries because they have different inheritances. But in this country, you talk about a poet and it's someone who's basically the profession that's away with the fairies. And my favorite question is, would you trust a poet to fix your car? Not a chance. I remember I had a friend I used to try and help him do some stuff every so often, and he said I was as much use as a chocolate spanner. And I think back then I probably was, and that's how we expect poets to be. So I'm interested in reimagining the image of a poet a bit, to have a bit more life force and a bit more sense of being involved in this world, as well as, all the complicated involvement with, the other world or whatever it is. And I remember when I came across poetry of Pablo Neruda, a Chilean poet in my 20s. And like most people, when I was at school, I was introduced to poetry at the local comprehensive in Bungay, where I grew up. I couldn't make head or tail of it. And the stuff they taught us was all very strange. And I think they tried to get us to write sonnets and things like that. And we read some stuff about First World War poets. But didn't touch me at all. And it was only in my 20s when I came across, Pablo Neruda. Suddenly, this kind of poetry that I could imagine being spoken, in bars, the poet standing on the table or down at the docks or in the mines. And it was the kind of poetry that wasn't embarrassing. You could just imagine it moving normal people, not intellectuals or the extremely well educated or the rich. I could imagine it moving them to tears and to passion. And I thought, this is the good stuff. This is where I want to go.
I was thinking about my relationship with poetry, and I did English literature as a degree and as an A-level, and I loved poetry actually, and I never thought I would. I'm from a very working class background, not a lot of romance about stuff at certain times, but poetry does actually really speak to me, and I recommended it to somebody who might not necessarily have kind of got into poetry through their background, and they just said, do you know what, I'm really pleased that you sort of flagged that up as something that I should read, because they're from a military background and not great at confronting feelings or anything, but there is poetry that speaks to everyone and anyone if you get the right stuff. And also I was thinking about your poetry when I was reading it, and a lot of poetry takes a lot of decoding. You have to come to it with a lot of kind of knowledge, whereas yours is, for me, quite literal, and it punched me in the gut really, some of it. And I don't know if that's kind of what you're getting at there, that it's accessible more.
Kind of. I mean, accessible has a bit of a kind of taint of, dumbing down or making things like kind of paint by numbers. And I don't believe in that, but I believe that we don't have to write poetry that's code. We can use straightforward language to speak about really subtle things. I read a lot of poetry. I run a poetry magazine, I run a poetry press, I teach poetry. And most of the poetry that I pick up, randomly from books, it's really dull. And it feels like it's not reaching out to the reader at all. It's as if the poet has not thought about the fact that there is someone at the other end of it. And so I'm really interested in making it an act of communication, saying, look, here is this thing that I am fascinated by or I'm in love with. I want to show it to you. Let me take you on a journey. And I love it when people say to me, I'm not the kind of person who likes poetry, but I love your work, or I love this poem. It spoke to me, it touched me. That means a lot to me, definitely.
And when you say the thing that you're trying to communicate, I'm assuming in a lot of instances for you, that's nature.
It's fair to say that nature plays a pretty big role in a lot of my poetry. It's always there in the background, even if I'm not writing about it. So it's not as straightforward for me as, I like to write about nature. I like to write about the world and the world of things that are around me. And I like being in nature, and it's what restores me. And it's where I feel inspired, and it's where I go when all my eloquence has dried up and all the words just fall out of my mouth like sawdust and putty. So yeah, it's there. My relationship with nature is part of what keeps me sane, or moves me in the right direction of sanity anyway. And like I say, going to nature is the primary thing that sparks a flow of language that, that can end up being a poem.
And specifically, I'm going to focus on Sometimes a Wild God because it's the one that I've looked at the most. And the reason I got in touch with you was because you cropped up on a newsletter, and then we connected on LinkedIn, and it seemed quite serendipitous. But the poem that I was introduced to you via was Sometimes a Wild God, and I can't possibly begin to translate it for people, and they will need to read it and take what they will from it. And I'm sure you have meaning behind it that people will maybe never get access to because it's so personal. But given the fact that our environment is very much in a mess, there was one kind of line in it that really struck me, and it really got me. So the premise is that the wild god comes to dinner, really, in your house, and there's a line which says,
"It is the tiger who comes to tea."
Yeah,
in
exactly.
wild god form.
Yeah, so it's like the adult
I
version.
didn't realize at the time, but I did a few years ago.
Oh, didn't you? Oh, that's interesting.
No, no.
So anyway, you've got this wild god tiger at your table, and and one of the lines says, "I haven't much, you say, and give him the worst of your food," which for me was just like, oh, ouch. It really encapsulated this kind of rightful shame that we have
Mm,
around the way that we've mistreated the wild things. And it was like, there's this kind of petty selfishness. We can't stop giving up things, not even for the benefit of this wild being. And I kind of thought that really encapsulated our approach to the environment. Is that the premise behind it on a
it's,
higher
it's,
level?
it's one of them for sure. I mean, the whole thing, because I don't like to talk about the poem too much because I don't want to tell people what it means. But that line for me, when I think of it, and I remember when I was writing it, there was that very much the relationship between this human and this wild god, and just that miserliness, even in the face of this extraordinary encounter, that any sense of dignity or integrity or generosity, hospitality was dead at that point. I'm a big believer in hospitality as a great virtue and one of the foundation pieces of a healthy society, that you give the stranger the best of what you have. And, having lived a little bit in other countries and experienced it there, I'm appalled at how ungenerous a lot of us are when people come to our houses. I could talk about that for hours and get into more nuance because it is very, very different in different places and in different classes and stuff. So certainly that sense of, yeah, we've lost the way to be generous and to appreciate moments where you bring out the best. In the poem, it's your food, but the best of yourself with our people, with our families, and with the environment, and with our interactions with our children. Are we giving the best of our food, or are we giving the worst of our food? What are we saving it for? It's like when those moments turn up, bring out everything. Don't save anything. I was on an island in Greece. I used to live in Greece. I lived in Athens for a while. I had a Greek girlfriend who was making a film about Greek gypsy identity. So we were hanging out with a lot of gypsies in Greece. And while we were there, we went to this amazing called the goat dancers on the island of Skiros, about this time of year, if I remember right. And long story short, they dance in the streets for 3 days and nights, covered in bells and kind of beating each other with sticks, and covered in sheep skins, and they wear the masks of stillborn goat skins and things. But we got talking to this fisherman from the island and ended up going back to his house and met his wife at some ungodly hour of the morning. And we had met him, a couple of hours before, and he ended up bringing out, as soon as we came into the house, he brought out a bottle of brandy that he'd been saving for about 30 years, and without a second thought, poured it for us as if we were royalty. And I thought, there is some grace and beauty here that is so precious. And yeah, it touched me deeply. So I think that's part of where that line came from as well.
And also, talking about that festival, I got the feeling that you should be more unbridled and that we should live more on the wild side through that poem. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say that's something I'm interested in. And the last 18 months, I've been working on a book actually kind of exploring wildness, because the word wild is one which we use in all sorts of different ways. And, a lot's been written about it, a lot's been said. What is it to live with wildness? There are some marvelous things about that, and there are some fairly problematic things about that. So it's not straightforward, but certainly living with aliveness, that's dear to my heart for sure. One of the things that I teach in my poetry writing, teaching as much as anything, is just carrying that awareness of we might not get another day, another week, another month, whatever. We simply don't know. So why hold back? Why hold the secrets close to our chest when we could be trying to communicate them to one another? To me, that's part of wildness as well. Not living with the assumption that we will be here for any length of time, and seizing life. Yeah.
And I think that possibly one of the fears attached to being unshackled in that way and to really kind of letting the wild in is something that I think you summed up in The Nettle Eater, which is once you become that wild, can you ever come back from it?
Yeah, I mean, Nettle Eater does kind of follow on from sometimes the wild God a bit, doesn't it? One's an encounter with the wild coming in, and the other's a full-blown surrender to it. Yeah, and what's the price of that? When you move outside the fences of constrained society, where do you go, and how do you navigate that, and what does come back and what doesn't come back? But in my experience, eventually there are enough of us trying to live before we die that we kind of find each other and keep each other going. Everyone's interested in being alive, really, under all the grey overcoats and strange shackles that we wear of just, as they say in Scotland, doing away. How are you doing? Doing away. Just about living one day after the other. Underneath all that, there's still a creature inside us all, desperate to be as alive as we could be.
Yeah, and I'm always fascinated by the idea that it strikes me in lots of different disciplines. It could be garden design, it's quite common in, it could be horticultural trends. There seems to be this thing, which, for want of a better word, is the zeitgeist, and we collectively tap into it. And the reason, as I said, I came across your work was through a newsletter I got from Gordon White, who's a podcaster. I remember him saying in one of his podcasts, the idea wanted to be in the world. We're just the mouth hole that it burped through, which I thought was fantastic
Yeah.
because it's like there are these threads of ideas that want to bubble up and someone somewhere is going to latch onto it and then express it into the world. And I think you kind of experience that a little bit with Sometimes the Wild God. And, how do you feel about this undercurrent of ideas that just bubble and burp out of people?
Oh, absolutely. My job is to listen and be as skilled as I can to lay threads down from the other world, is what I call it. That place of ideas, the imagination, the feeling world, the interior world, be it the subtle world where these things are bubbling all the time. My job is to listen and then to be able to draw those threads through and lay them down using language as best I can. And so with Sometimes a Wild God, for example, I was in the right place at the right time with the right kind of ear open. And, I did a good job of being able to bring that through. But that was back in 2012. And in all honesty, Sarah, I'm still slightly apprentice to that poem. I'm still trying to understand what it does and why and how. To me, it's, all poems that are alive are magical objects, spirits, they're people, and the spirit or person of that poem is a big one and a strong one. And it was itching to come through, apparently. And I'm glad I was there. It's opened all sorts of doors for me. And I know through what people have written to me that it's changed people's lives and in a few cases saved people's lives. And you can't really ask for much more than that as a poet. That's a job well done there. But I'm still learning from that whole process and just how to do that, how to listen, how to lay the thread down with the best use of language so that it's a true representation in this world of that thing that I've glimpsed out there beyond the fences and the hedges.
I think many gardeners are very connected to the other world through being outdoors. And I know this is probably a difficult question to answer, but if you could encourage people to listen or to get in touch with listening to whatever comes through to them when they're outdoors, what advice would you give?
I think what you say about gardeners and people who spend time in contact with nature, it's true, certainly in the Celtic conception of the other world. The gateways to the other world, the places where the veils are thin and all of that, they exist out there in the natural world. And what would I say? I would say that part of making contact with that other world is a process of falling in love, or it's certainly very similar to falling in love. And falling in love with a place can lead to extraordinary things. So that might mean tending a tiny, tiny bit of ground, or just noticing a bend in the river or a part of a hill and going back to it over, 4 seasons or whenever you can, and just deepening your connection. But I suppose for me, the world's alive and everywhere is people. So you get the most out of being around people by getting to know them and building up relationships with them. And it's the same with place, isn't it? And it's the same with nature. So regard it as a person or a spirit or a being, however you want to frame it, and get to know it. Be curious, see how it changes over time. The natural world, in my experience, or places love being told stories to. They love poetry being shared with them. That's my way. I'll go out into the wilds and I'll tell stories and I'll read poems and I'll talk to the land. And then if I've got any sense in me, I'll listen as well, just as much as I talk. But it's two-way traffic. You have to offer something of yourself, I think, whether that's just your attention or your art. Become devoted to a place or an aspect of place. That's what I'd say.
A huge thanks to Tom for sharing his creative genius and for encouraging us to be more hospitable to the wild god. And thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 282, Song of the Garden, and episode 251, Green Roofs and City Wildlife. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.